Okay, so today we have a couple details from Chapter 8 that I left off on that we just have to sort of fill in. And then we're going to start on Chapter 10, which is the sensory system. So we've already been introduced to that system a bit because we've had that lab. And so when you go back even to the lab sheet, we're going to fill in some of the information. And when it comes down to it, again, just sometimes I just like to orient our mind to things. We're really going to basically do maybe half or so of Chapter 10 today. The lab itself is sort of talking about muscles, measuring sort of muscle activity for you guys. Then on Monday we finish Chapter 10, maybe even begin Chapter 12, which is skeletal muscle. You're going to see on Chapter 12, I really simplify the chapter quite a bit. I almost make the 10 steps of muscle contraction and relaxation being almost the entire chapter. So it's going to be relatively simple compared to Chapter 10. But either way, on next Wednesday then, we will finish the material and be able to sort of review / work on the extra questions. Okay, and exam 2 then being a week and a half or so. Again, basically 8, 10, 12, and all the drugs that we talked about. Okay, so that came from lab. All of that's on this exam coming up, this lecture exam. There's no lab that day. Next Wednesday, there's no lab too. And again, I'm available to sort of stay and help for questions, etc. For that. And then we're done with 2 units. Any questions about anything coming up? Except, like, what do we do? Okay, this is actually a really important concept. And to get this across, let me just kind of quickly draw a nerve here. Or, whatever you call what I draw. And, of course, we're releasing neurotransmitter to affect a postsynaptic cell. And again, we have this whole idea. And even since we haven't done this, here it is. Because it's going to relate to this. We talked about, of course, 2 types of potentials that was going to happen within, if you look at a neuron. The ones with the dendrites and cell body were which kind again? And remember, the strength of the graded was dependent upon the signal strength. Okay? So that if we had a larger signal, we were going to have a larger graded potential. Okay? Now, the action potentials that we talked about here, did they vary depending upon the signal strength? Okay? So they're all going to be the same, either all or nothing. So what that's addressing, and then I'm going to make something sort of clear, is the idea of since the action potentials are all or nothing, well, when we get to the end of the day here, we need to know what that signal strength was. We need to know whether it was strong or weak, and if we're just getting, an action potential of the same size, how are we going to know if it was a strong or a weak signal? And that has to do with what this is. That's sort of coding for a stimulus. Basically, what it's going to be is, and we're going to demonstrate this, it's not going to be the shape and size of an action potential. It's going to be the frequency of action potentials. Okay? So, I will show the diagram. Frequency of action potentials, which are going to be, basically, let's actually just show this overall, which is going to be this, okay? It's going to be frequency of action potentials means how many action potentials per time. So, action potentials, over time, or we can even make it just to make it sort of, how many action potentials per second. That's the frequency of action potentials. And the idea, just looking it up here before we kind of look at it again, that if we have I'll get oriented eventually. If we have, let's say, a weak versus a strong stimulus. Again, we already realize it's going to create either a larger or a smaller gradient potential. And let's say they both reach threshold. And we're going to have an action potential that looks the same size and shape. And right now, we're not even drawing it out, like the whole shape. We're just drawing it as a line. But the idea will be that if it's a strong signal, that means that even as that action potential is going, that means we're still going to be above threshold. We've got a lot there, and another one's going to go, and another one is going. So it's how many basically action potentials per time will reach the end. And so if you have, and they make it sort of simple, let's say we had a relatively weak stimulus, but it did reach threshold, there might be, 4, this kind of frequency of action potentials reaching the end. And remember, how many action potentials reach the end will determine the release of neurotransmitter, okay? And the neurotransmitter can be interpreted how much based, on whoever receives this, how strong of a signal it is. So a weak signal, again, by this diagram, maybe 4 action potentials within this period of time, releasing 4 neurotransmitter molecules. If we have a stronger stimulus, all right, if you reach threshold, again, the action potential itself is the same size, but now we're going to have more of them reach the end in a given period of time. The frequency of action potentials, okay, are going to be greater, which means during that period of time, we're going to release more neurotransmitter. And that's how, even though the middle will be constant action potentials, we'll have a relationship between the beginning and the end. So again, the stronger the signal here will be the greater potential, but it will mean the frequency of action potentials reaching the end, and therefore the release of neurotransmitter will be proportional to the signal strength. I want to put that a different way while we start to grasp sort of the language of that. And this is sort of, something I really want to sort of get here. There's a difference between the speed of conduction of an action potential, which we talked about before, and I'm going to put it. Okay, versus the frequency of action potentials. The speed of conduction of action potential is basically how fast the action potential will travel down a given neuron. So the speed of an action potential along the axon of a given neuron. What are the 2 things that control that? What are the 2 things that control the speed of conduction of an action potential along a given neuron?
Myelination.
And
Diameter.
right. That's what determines this. Okay? That's going to be how fast it travels, like in meters per second. Something like that. How fast, if we trigger it, is going to travel down a given axon is dependent upon, again, the diameter of the axon and its degree, or if it is myelinated or not, myelination. Okay? That is a different concept than what we're putting up here. The frequency of action potentials are how many action potentials per second basically reach the nerve terminal. Okay? And so that's going to basically be, this is always going to be for that neuron. This is going to depend upon the signal strength for that neuron. Okay? So for that particular neuron, basically a strong signal will have a higher frequency. Again, that's action potentials per second reaching the end. So a strong stimulus, again, will have a higher frequency of action potentials. Which again, that means, and you can show it up there, that's how many action potentials per second. That means it's going to cause more neurotransmitter release okay? And so, and again, so the frequency, let's say, I could have put that above here too. So again, the stronger the stimulus, the greater the frequency of action potentials, which is action potentials per second, that's going to result in more neurotransmitter release, and therefore, postsynaptically, we're going to be able to realize it's a stronger signal. So make sure you have this information, and then you start to try to visualize this or try to picture it, because it's sort of a concept that can be confusing. Because speed of action potentials, frequency of action potentials, you're like, isn't that the same thing? And it's not. Yes.
Postsynaptically mean what?
It means like after this release, because right now it could go to a muscle, a nerve, or a part of our brain. It means that we're going to be able to postsynaptically, after this synapse, be able to basically determine from this if it were a strong or a weak stimuli. And this will make even more sense today, because then we're going to talk specifically about, let's say this was, we're going to do it in a couple of minutes. If we're trying to figure out if we're listening to my voice, and so we're going to learn how the ear operates and transduces sound. Well, the key is, how are we going to know if it's going to just be action potentials going to our brain? Dot, dot, dot. How are you going to know that it was me whispering or me shouting? Okay, that's the strength of a stimulus. So it will end up being basically like this. We're going to have, the cochlear nerves send action potentials, to the brain, to our cortex of the brain. But if it's whispering, it's going to send, a lower frequency of action potentials, less neurotransmitter, and our brain will go, Mike's whispering. Okay. But if it's a shout, it's going to cause higher frequency of action potentials reaching the brain, and our brain's going to see that's going to mean when it hits the auditory cortex that Michael is shouting kidney or whatever he's shouting. Okay, so we're getting introduced to it abstractly here, but then we're going to see, right away today, that's how it's applying for us to our brain to interpret whether we have, a weak stimulus or a strong stimulus. It's not going to make this action potential go faster. That's all dependent upon the diameter myelination of the nerve. But if you measure in time, which is kind of what this axis is, there'll be, the stronger the stimulus, there'll be, more action potentials per time, more neurotransmitter release, and so we're able to interpret that this originated from a stronger stimulus than this. So the ends are connected now. This is always constant, based on the neuron. It's just, it's basically just the same size and shape. But we have to somehow have a relationship between the signal strength and knowing that it was a signal strength. So that's how it basically is. Speed, the frequency of action potentials. And make sure you write that down and get that language and start to get it. Because people, I spend more time on this because questions on the exam that students often miss have to do not understanding this difference because it's confusing. Okay, so I'm trying to find a couple different ways to write it, and you can come back to me. Sometimes you guys come up with even better ways to visualize it in your mind. Okay, that was point one. The last thing in the chapter that we didn't cover, and one student's already asked me about it. So we covered all this. Summation. We've covered it in a way. We've talked about it, but we haven't, especially when we did the drug video, but we didn't define it. So, and in fact, well, I'll show a picture and then put it up there. So, we talked about, just when we were defining how a nerve works, that the cell body basically integrates, adds up the positive and negative signals. Well, okay, adding up is summating. And so there's two ways we do this. First of all, I show this picture just so we realize that we don't have sort of, one input coming in or two, and then we have the dendrites. All of our neurons are basically receiving, hundreds of inputs. Some excitatory, some inhibitory, that we've got to figure out what the end result is. But there's two types of addition, so to speak. And I'll look at this picture first. There's spatial summation, and all that means, refers to the fact that we are getting inputs from different areas. And we basically, so they're innervating the dendrites in different places, different spaces. But when it comes down to it, all these signals, which again are excitatory and inhibitory, and we're adding up these numbers on the way to the trigger zone. And that's what spatial summation is. So, even if you just put an example of that, just by numbers to kind of get it. Again, when you look at the resting membrane potential of minus 70 and threshold being minus 55, again, that means we needed a depolarizing stimulus of how much?
15.
Plus 15. Okay? And so the idea then is, let's say you have this neuron, and you have kind of what we have here, 3 different neurons innervating it on dendrites, and plus plus minus, and we already know that's not charged, that's excitatory, releasing neurotransmitters causing excitatory postsynaptic potentials. Here's one called inhibitory. Now let's say that if we were measuring what when one of these fires is at the trigger zone. Now let's say when we do that, let's say this plus was actually plus 10 change, this was plus 10 as well, and this represented a minus 10, okay, inhibitory signal, making it more negative. So the idea, again, you could just sort of, this is neuron 1, 2, and 3. If you fire neuron 1 once, would you have an actual potential based upon what we're saying? No, it's only plus 10. If you fired number 2 once, what would happen? What if you fired 1 and 2 simultaneously?
Yeah.
10 plus 10, 20. That's spatial summation, okay? What if you fired all 3?
No.
No. And that's the idea what I was trying to even get before the drug video of how you're, and you gotta remember, we have hundreds of these, we don't have 3. We're getting excitatory and inhibitory signals in. Whether we fire or not depends on how these add up by the time we reach the trigger zone, and does it reach threshold or not, and that's what we want. We don't want everything to fire. So, if we want something to fire, again, maybe we'll increase the positive signal come in, and do what to the negative? Get rid of it, inhibit the inhibitory. Remember, 2 ways to get these things going. You increase the positive, or you inhibit the inhibitory, okay? And that's sort of what we were doing with the drug video, right? We were basically saying some things, it was the other way around, but some things excite this thing, or if you get rid of the inhibitor, then it also does. But that's what summation is, spatial summation. You're just adding up the input from what's firing. It's that easy.
Is it to reach a stimulus? Is that what you're saying? But when you say this, you mean
Wait, say
stimulus?
that first part again.
When you're saying inhibit the inhibitory or add the positive, are you talking about do that in order to reach a stimulus?
No,
Or-
this would represent, we don't know what the original stimulus was. This is what's coming in from the presynaptic cell, okay? Something's happening up here, but it's releasing a neurotransmitter onto this. That's going to either excite or inhibit the chances of this firing.
Okay.
So that's the presynaptic cell?
These are the presynaptic cells, and this is the postsynaptic cell.
Okay.
And here is, in this case, the synapse. I mean, it's going to have another thing down
Yeah.
here, we're right. So we're saying here's 3 presynaptic cells innervating a postsynaptic one. Is this going to fire or not? Depends upon, are these firing, and what is the strength of their excitatory or inhibitory? How do we know? Well, add them up, okay? But again, I mean, here I'm giving numbers, but I mean, that's really what the cell is actually doing, adding up that by the time you reach the trigger zone, what is the overall change in voltage going to be? If all this adds up, and it's in this case we're starting here, and it's, it changes it by plus 15, we're going to fire. If these are adding up and it doesn't reach that threshold voltage, there will be no actual potential. Spatial summation. Temporal means what? Time. So, we don't fire once and saying let's call it a day. These things are constantly firing, and so the picture to show temporal summation is, in this case, we're just looking at one input, okay, up here. So we're only looking at one of these thousands that are there. And again, as we described before, let's just say the firing of, we're just looking at this guy, okay? We don't even care about these guys. So we're just looking at him. And we said, if you fire it once, plus 10 wouldn't do it. Now let's say you fire it once, okay, and then you wait a bit, and all the ions have dissipated out, resistance and leakage, and fire it again, well, we're still in that kind of trouble here, right? But what if you fire them quickly, okay? Let's say you fire them and you had 10, and we started to leak out, but within a short period of time you fired another one to get another burst of 10. Now all of a sudden you have enough at this point right here, trigger zone, to actually reach threshold. So that's temporal summation. It's the idea of the speed of firing is also going to affect whether it reaches threshold or not. And both these things go on at the same time, right? I mean, you have hundreds of inputs and they're firing at different rates. But that's really when when a nerve is deciding, or if it's being determined whether it's going to fire or not, it's a combination of the spatial summation of input and how fast these ones are firing, which is Any questions about that? To some extent, kind of common sense, easier than this one at least. That's chapter 8. And we move on, that's interesting, to chapter.
Is there any way we can measure T-cell simulation? Is that the sequence?
I mean, first of all, that's what they're kind of doing here too, right? I mean, you can literally put probes in versus out. I mean, when you're measuring electroactivity, let's say you can do this right here. You can probably do it in like an animal model. You can, or you can do it in cells that are in culture. Yeah, you literally can put a probe in versus outside, measure the change in voltage and memory potential, and you'll see it jumping around. You'll actually see it. You'll actually record it. Now, in a way. Okay, well, we'll see in lab next time. We're going to measure sort of an indirect way of measuring electroactivity that are occurring within the muscles, which are going to be similar to nerves as well. So, yep, you can actually measure them. Chapter 10. Sensory physiology. Now, luckily, part of what these questions are addressing, we've actually just answered. We're going to see this in a couple of minutes, because I just talked about that, right? But overall, it is this idea that we have these different senses. We had this in lab a little bit. We briefly talked about it. That's why I wasn't, emphasizing let's go crazy on it in lab. I just want us to play with the game a bit, because we're going to do it now. But all of these are taking in stimuli. They're all going to be changed into action potentials, changed or transduced. How is the brain going to know what it is, where it's coming from, etc.? You ask, I answer. First of all, here's a little table, which of course we don't memorize. This just sort of shows different senses. The ones that are conscious of. Now we're going to talk, we're going to spend more time on some than others. Okay, we're going to spend some time with touch, pain, and vision and hearing. Taste and smell we'll just mention. We're not going to talk about these guys. We can look at this though for a second and realize that when we're talking about sensory information, we're not just talking about conscious information that we're receiving from the external environment. This stuff's pretty important if you think about it. When we talk about homeostasis, we're talking about that we want constant internal signaling to basically be telling us what our blood pressure is, the osmolarity, pH, etc. That we overall gain for those homeostatic mechanisms. Well, these were the sensors within our body that will then detect this and then react to it. And we're going to be talking about a lot of these later on. The next unit is cardiovascular, and we're going to be talking about controlled blood pressure quite a lot. So, we'll get to this idea. So we're going to talk about some of these. Now, the only reason I put this up, it's sort of a silly diagram, but I want us to get that terminology, what a receptor potential is. And to do that again, if we draw that normal neuron like we had before, okay, my normal neuron overall. Again, we just said it, we just said it again, that this represents a graded potential, basically upon, will be different size and shape depending upon the stimulus strength, and it occurs here. Now, all this is, if you look at this overall for sensory receptors, again, you have this idea that we're going to have a sensory receptor, and there'll be of different types that we'll talk about. That will, again, so this will be the receptor. That's going to send information to the CNS via a sensory neuron. And of course, we'll have the efferent going to some effector. Again, just like we talked about before, receptor, a sensory neuron, CNS, efferent, muscle, like an effector. So the only terminology is this, that when we talk about receptor potential, we're going to be talking about graded potentials that happen within sensory receptors. So when we talk about sensory receptors here, they're going to be receptors which we're going to have the various stimuli, open and closed channels, causing change in potentials, which may lead to the action potential going to the CNS. It's the same way, okay? It's the same idea that we're looking here, except now we're talking specifically the sensory receptors that are receiving information and transmitting to the brain. And so when they're opening and closing channels from whatever this signal is, like, it creates a graded potential. And the only difference is then we're calling it receptor potential. They're graded potentials that happen within receptors, within sensory receptors. That's all that is. Because receptors, we're going to see there are kind of two classes of them, but overall that's still the basic idea, that they're going to be basically taking in signals, changing them, transducing them into electrical chemical, and sending them up to the brain. And in fact, if we kind of go to our famous diagram here, which is a clear diagram of it, that's sort of the half of this chapter, or the half of this diagram we're going to be describing in this chapter. Some sort of signal, we're going to show you how those signals are changed by our sensory receptors into electrical chemical impulses that travel through sensory neurons, and a little bit of how our brain interprets it, basically figures out what they are. So, again, that's all, the only reason I put this kind of pathway up is just so to talk about that. Receptor potentials, graded potentials that happen within sensory receptors. All right. The only thing while we're up here too is, what are we going to do in the final chapter, chapter 12? This. Okay? We're going to examine chapter 12, the control of the nervous system, and even in lab, this next lab, over skeletal muscle. Again, we're skipping this whole branch of the efferents because we're doing that in the very next unit, starting a couple weeks from today when we do cardiac. Okay, there's a concept that's a very wordy concept that's going to make sense as we look at each sensory receptor. But overall, we're going to be talking about sensory receptors being of one of two types. Okay, and they're going to be kind of illustrated here. In one type, the sensory receptor and the afferent sensory neuron is basically one unit. So that what's actually the receptor, what's actually changing the information, represent the dendrites of the sensory neuron. Okay, so you sort of have, whether it's wrapped or not, what we're calling the receptor, which is what's changing the signal. Okay, we have whatever the signal is, light, sound, etc. Whatever's changing the signal into electrochemical impulses is the receptor. Well, this one class we have is basically, what is doing that are actually the dendrites of the sensory neuron that's going to the CNS. It doesn't matter, by this definition, while we're classifying it, whether the dendrites are free nerve endings, like that, or if they're sort of wrapped in connective tissue, because, which are some of the other sensory neurons in our skin, and we'll look at those. But the key is, it doesn't matter, because really, again, what's changing the signal is actually the nerve endings of the sensory neuron going to the brain. But the other class, and we'll see which senses have it, this is an example of what's going to be how we hear sound. The other example is you have two separate cells. You have a specialized receptor cell, which will change the signal into some sort of electrochemical, and it's synapsing upon the sensory neuron. So two pieces. Just go back a second. So we sort of have, again, this one-piece system and this 2-piece system. Remember, they're both using sensory neurons to get to the brain. But the idea is, one, the receptors are the dendrites themselves. Here, it's a specialized cell that synapses upon the dendrites of it. Very wordy concept. If you read the book, they're going to be calling these neural and non-neural, and it's really not accurate. So I can't call it, so it'd be nice, because it's a lot easier to say neural, non-neural, but I can't really say that. So I'm going to be defining it almost just like that. It's either going to be one of these two types, where the receptor represents the dendrites, or it's going to be, I didn't write it there, the other, a specialized cell. And we're going to, between the next couple of days, we're going to look at all the senses that we're going to cover. And one of the things we're going to classify them will be based upon which type it is. And so either dendrites, because I'm going to summarize this, or specialized cell. Which one does that sense use? So I had to sort of get us the first orientation. It's very abstract right now. It's like, what are you talking about? But hopefully you got an idea. Second one. The other thing that we're going to put to define all the senses is basically every receptor that we're going to talk about, except for one, responds to only one type of stimuli, and here are sort of the 4 classes of receptors that exist. Some only respond to chemicals. That means if you're a chemoreceptor, you don't respond to light or temperature or anything else. If you're a mechanoreceptor, you're not going to respond to a chemical. You respond to only one of these, except for exception that we'll talk about. And so as we go through the senses, we'll basically be seeing what does it respond to. So what type of receptor is it? Which is referring to what stimuli, what type of stimulus is it going to respond to. And so that's where we're going to fill this in next couple of times. But that's the intro. This is going to be familiar. This is the 2-point discrimination that we did in lab. Now we have a little more lecture on it that will hopefully help clarify it even more. So this is, again, I still like to do it with my guy, or gal, can't really tell. That'll work. So, again, we're talking about the overall idea that we're talking about somatosensor, we're talking about sensory receptors in our body, and as we said in the lab, we don't expect to have the same sensitivity all over our body, the same ability to discriminate. And so some areas are more sensitive, more discriminating than others. Sensitive. And again, just kind of like we started in lab, we're going to just add some bullet points, but use this. So again, we take an area, equal area of our, let's say, our finger versus the back of our neck, something like that. Which one has the higher density of receptors? Okay, we can even put this. This is going to make sense. This has a higher, the more sensitive a region is, it's going to have a higher density of receptors. Now, we'll see a better diagram of this in a second, but the idea of this too is when we look at the receptive field, of a receptor, it's sort of, again, the area that if you basically hit this area, that receptor is going to fire.
That looks like a gingerbread.
Okay, so now here's my keys doing it. So anything in that area, that's going to fire, and send information. That area, that will fire. That's a receptive field. If you looked at something like this, okay, you could see that these have larger receptive fields. Okay, so you're going to have where, because we don't have as many of them, basically this whole area, much larger than this, maybe it doesn't show up on that, we'll be able to stimulate that one. So, higher density receptors, these have smaller receptive fields. And that's why when we look at the two-point discrimination, which we're gonna look at that and add a couple more features here, it sort of should make sense in a way. Even I have to use my keys because I didn't bring up those little guys. I don't know. The idea is, again, we have this idea that if this were only a couple millimeters, but if we had this area on your fingertips and you were at that level and you hit it, you would feel how many points?
2.
2, because it's hitting 2 different receptive fields, 2 different neurons. If you had that same distance and you do the back of your arms or the back of the neck, you would feel 1, because you're hitting that same receptive field. Okay, and that's why the more sensitive regions have higher density receptors, smaller receptive field, and therefore you will have a smaller two-point discrimination value. You can discriminate 2 points better in an area like this, okay? Because again, you want to have your fingertips able to read Braille. You don't need to read Braille on your back. You just have to know there's something there. So smaller receptive fields mean that you're going to have a smaller two-point discrimination value. You can discriminate 2-point, let me just write it, discrimination value. Here, you might be able to just discriminate 2 points at 2 millimeters. Here, it might be 10 millimeters. So smaller value, more sensitive areas. But let's look at something else that we didn't look at before. Like I wanted this picture here. There's another factor besides that contributes to the receptive fields and the sensitivity, and that has to do, actually let me go back to this figure as well. The idea of convergence, and we'll see this a lot in this, that if you have, or let's say you have 3 neurons, okay, 3 primary neurons with their receptive fields, but if they synapse upon one one secondary neuron, okay, they converge. That means, if you feel anything, or if you have a point here, here, or here, or all there, you're only going to feel 1 point. It's less sensitive. So if you look at something like this, it shows you really well. If you have areas which are discriminating like in your fingertips, you're going to have less convergence. And that's why when you hit 2 points this far away, it's hitting 2 different neurons, hitting 2 different signals to the brain. It knows it's 2 points. But if you take an area like the back of your neck, etc., and you're doing that, you see it's actually, there's a lot of convergence, so that basically anything that's hitting on this whole range of any of these will actually send 1 signal to the brain. We're not going to be able to discriminate this. We simply will know there's something in that area, which is good. Okay, it's not like you want to have no sensitivity there. You want to know there's a bear on my back. You want to know something's going on there or something. I mean, that's the example I use. But you don't have to read Braille. You don't need it as specific. And so and we'll see this with vision too. So smaller 2-point discrimination value. All those we did in lab. But I want to actually put then you will have less convergence. The more sensitive a region like this, more a 1-to-1, less of this convergence. Less convergence.
And would it be safe to say more accuracy?
More discriminating power, which is, who said that? Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by accuracy. It's going to be able to discriminate, 2 points closer together. So in a way, I see that idea of accuracy with it. In that sense, for sure. If you're trying to localize something, you're going to localize it, more accurately, by that versus knowing it's somewhere over there, right?
Convergence is like all of them going into one receptor.
Yeah, or at least a lot of them going into
Yeah.
fewer, right? Like that, exactly. So exactly, this is convergence. These are going to be less sensitive regions than where you have, than you have more of a 1-to-1. And we'll add in a minute one more bullet point to this. But this as far as what we wanted to get out of the lab, there's some correspondence between that lab and this obviously it's on the lecture, so it's covered. Okay? So far we have that. We'll add one thing in a minute. So, we need to send these signals to the brain. We're going to have sensory neurons. Now, there's cranial nerves that do it, and I guess for anatomy, who knows what you memorize, and I don't really care. So, but here's what I do want you to know for this class. That as we're going up to its cortical region, which we're going to see, all the sensory information coming from the outside of the body goes to the thalamus before it goes to the cortex, except smell, olfaction. Now look at this picture here. So, and we're not going to have to measure the specific, or you're not going to have to identify the specific places the visual cortex is, somatosensories, etc., because that's anatomy too. But all that's the same, all these senses we're talking about are going to go through the thalamus and then go to the cortical regions, except smell, because it's an old sense. It actually goes to something called the olfactory bulb and then to the cortex. It doesn't route through the thalamus. So, you know that. So, before we get into pain, which is the main topic for today, I'll take it right. So we still have one more global thing. Just answering these questions, and these will be easy. So again, I kind of have this idea. Again, we know we're just getting electrochemical messages. The brain has to figure out basically what it is it sound or taste, etc., where it's coming from, and as we've already started to say, what is the intensity and how long it lasts. So we answer those questions. And they're easy answers. So modality, which means kind of what it is, it's where it ends up on the cortex. So if the signal's coming in, act potentials, and it hits this region of the cortex, we're going to interpret it as sight. Okay, we're going to, if you just hit that neuron in the cortex, you'll see some sort of some sort of light or something, because that's the idea. So what it is determines on where it lands on the cortex. If the signal ends up hitting the auditory cortex, we will hear something. It's a sound. Somatosensory, we will feel something. So that's sort of how it knows, because all it's getting is action potentials, a neurotransmitter. That's how it knows what it is. That's how the brain can interpret it, where it lands on the cortex. Okay, how about where it's from? Okay, we know that it's sight, but how do we know it's coming? I'm looking at you versus looking at you. Or if it's touch, okay, and I have the keys here, how do I know it's this feeling of touch is coming from my right hand versus somewhere else? The answer is that sort of within each cortical region, we have sort of our own little map. Okay, we have a visual field map. The one that we like to illustrate because it's fun is sort of the somatosensory map. So the map of our entire body is mapped. If you look at sort of this region, here's the somatosensory cortex. That's where, the part of the cortex in which we will get information and process, what's coming from outside of our body. But within that, there's another map. And these pictures are always nice because it actually doesn't just list this, but it kind of shows a figure. Because there's two features on the left about that map, which is really interesting that I want us to know. And we'll even add part of it here. So this is an example of the somatosensory cortex. And the idea is, so different regions of the body are represented here. But again, those two things right there. This is not a linear representation, okay, on the cortex to our body. Again, sort of the easy example is the feet are not physically located next to your genitals on your body, but on the somatosensory map, they are. And Stu, when I went to Stu's class, and he might know because he's smart, he thinks that maybe foot fetishes, if you might have heard of those, comes from this fact. Of course, he got a laugh out of it, I don't know that, but I think, he had some basis for it, because again, if people have foot fetishes, there is, if there's some overlap between these reaches of the cortex, it would actually make sense of that, okay? I'm just saying that could be. But it does remind us, yes, the cortical map is not linear. Now, here's the other one that's really important that we're going to put here. The representation on the cortex is not the same as your surface area. It's based upon the level of sensitivity, because there's going to be more neurons coming to your brain that you've got to process. And so if you look at this representation, it's very, very good. You can see we get most of our information, most of our sensory receptors are located where?
Hands.
Hands and
Face.
face, especially
Lips.
tongue and lips. And look at this power is, if you look at the area representation, your entire torso, okay, which obviously takes up a lot of area, has this much representation. Your hands, or even just your lips and tongue, has that much. So it's not proportional to the surface area, it's proportional to the sensitivity, and therefore, the more sensitive a region, you're going to have a greater representation. Representation, somatosensory cortex. To finish this puppy up. Any questions about that?
Yes. So arrow representation in words would be the higher the more representation. What is
The arrow, yeah, the
Yeah.
arrow represents the
More.
more, yeah.
Bigger.
I'm gonna put that. Greater, yeah, more representation on the cortex. As can be seen here. And that's where we get most of our information from the outside world. That's where we had the highest density of receptors. Hands and face, basically, are the major things. We don't care about that. So, the last two ones, the intensity and duration of stimulus, we just did this. So now here it is again. So we know how strong the stimulus is by the frequency of action potentials, how long it is by these action potentials just lasting a longer period of time. So that's how, sort of in a global sense, stepping back, how our brain can basically figure out, even though all it's receiving is action potentials and releasing molecules of neurotransmitter, how it can figure out what it is, where it's coming from, how strong it is, and how long it's lasting. Kind of talked about this in lab a little bit. Tonic versus phasic receptors. Okay, you can see the words here, and we'll show the picture that will help it. Tonic receptors are when we need constant monitoring of things. Most of these are going to be those internal subconscious homeostatic ones, osmoreceptors, blood pressure, etc. Phasics, we're only measuring changes. And again, we'll just put the pictures. I think it's better, but smoke being a good example. So this figure actually, I think, kind of shows the point of it really well. And if we have a constant stimulus, and that's what these both are, and you have a phasic receptor, okay, it's going to react. Here's the receptor potential followed by action potentials. So it's going to basically react and send signals to the brain. But if you're a phasic receptor and you're not changing, the signal's not really changing, you basically are going to stop, not react anymore at the level of the receptor or to the brain. It's just simply, it monitors the change. Maybe when the signal stops, it will do it. Smell, again, you come to a room with someone with perfume or something, you might, detect it and smell it. Even though those odorants are still there, you might not be receiving the signal anymore. It simply is not dangerous, so those receptors adapt. Tonic receptors won't. And if you think about blood pressure, I probably said that in lab, you don't want blood pressure to be something like this where it's okay and then oops, it's not, and then you're going to do it. You want to constantly monitor it so you can change it. So most of the internal receptors are going to be, for homeostasis, are going to be tonic receptors, measuring your pH and everything else like that. Phasic receptors, and we're not going to define every sense by whether it's phasic or tonic at all, but a couple of them we know: smell, temperature is phasic. You're monitoring not absolute things, but changes in temperature, cold, hot. That's why if you did the experiment, you went from, if you had your hand in hot and you had your hand in cold, you would feel the exact opposite because it's monitoring the change in temperature. It went up or it went down. So that's an example. How about just touch? Phasic or tonic? It's phasic, and if you think about it, like when you first put your clothes on or something, you felt them, but you really don't, unless now you're thinking about it again, you don't really feel them again. They always use an example on this that if you put your hair in a knot or whatever, ponytail or something, I might go for ponytails since my hair's getting long. But when you first do it, you feel sort of the pressure. but now, unless you think about it, now you're not feeling it anymore. So as long as it's not painful, basically touch is sort of a phasic type of thing,
Why is there 2 humps on the second one?
The idea is usually what these do, they'll monitor a change. So if you have a constant stimulus, it stops, it basically adapts to it. But if there's a change in it, then it's also gonna monitor it. So it could be like, even with this, it's like, let's say you put your hair in a braid or whatever, and you felt it, and now you no longer feel it. If you take it out of the braid, you will feel it,
Yeah.
right? And
Oh, okay.
so it's just monitoring when there's a change. It doesn't care unless it's dangerous, that it's just staying the same. Versus here, especially those eternal ones, we've got to know, exactly what, a constant monitoring of what it is. So definitely that. But what do you think about pain, which we're going to talk about? Do you want pain to be phasic or tonic? Do you think? Yeah, we want it to be tonic.
Oh, why?
Because it's dangerous to our lives. We don't want to go. We don't want to go like, okay. Maybe we don't want to feel pain. And that's a whole other story. We did the drug video, right? But the idea is we want, from an evolution or whatever you want to call it, we want these receptors that are monitoring pain to constantly send pain signals, so we know what to do about it, because this is life-threatening. So somatosensory touch are phasic, but somatosensory pain are actually going to be tonic receptors. So we're going to do pain now. And that's the main thing we're going to cover today, and probably not much more than that. And pain is nociception. So we're not going to specifically cover that. We've already talked about touch a little bit. Now, the pathway to the brain. We're going to see all those senses have slightly different pathways to the brain, and we're not going to memorize every pathway to the brain. Okay? But we're going to memorize whose pathway to the brain? Pain to the brain. Okay? And there's a reason we're going to emphasize that. The reason I really care about that pathway. And while we're looking at this, I'll bullet point it as we go. Pain to the brain. If you look at all these, first of all, most of us know that most of our senses cross, into the other hemisphere. So things which are coming from our right side, if I'm holding this and this, is actually going to the cortex on my left hemisphere and vice versa. We're crossing the midline. Now, where these senses cross are different. So some of these senses, just in general, and we'll look at this, these guys here, they're going to go through the spinal cord, not synapse there across. They're going to actually then synapse first in the medulla, cross the midline there, and then to the thalamus and to the cortex on the opposite hemisphere. Other ones, including the one you need to know, pain, synapses in the spinal cord, crosses the midline there, goes and synapses, skips the medulla, synapses in the thalamus into the cortex. So they all are basically crossing the midline to the other hemisphere, and they're all going to the thalamus, like we said, and the cortex. But this is what's different. Where they synapse and cross. Again, you're not going to memorize which ones do what, except you've got to know pain's pathway to the brain. So pain is going to basically first synapse in the spinal cord. Okay? And in parentheses, I'll show that the reason I think that's important is that's going to enable us to have a reflex. We talked about reflexes in lab. It's going to have the fastest reflex we can have, a spinal reflex. So that we can have since again, we're talking about pain, we're talking survival, we don't want to have signals to send all the way to the brain and back to actually save our lives or reflex. We're going to literally have, and I'll show a picture of it, sort of this idea of a painful stimulus going to the spinal cord and then having an efferent muscle or something to withdraw it. Okay, so that's going to be why, if you had one of these, it has to actually ascend all the way to the brain before you can have a circuit back, because that's the first synapse. Pain, right away. So, synapse in the spinal cord, I want us to just realize it crosses the midline there, as you see. Okay, in the spinal cord, and then, synapses in the thalamus, and then, of course, to the cortex. That's the pathway of pain in the brain from this figure. That's the only one you need to know of this. Yes?
So, sometimes I hear about people getting shot and them not feeling it. How come they don't have reflexes? Like, they'll be like, oh, I didn't even know I got shot. Until, like, a little while after. Like, does that have to do with the adrenaline when it's pumping? Like,
I guess. When it comes down to it, too, we'll see this when we talk about pain. But the thing is, probably there was a reaction, and that's the difference too. There probably was a physical reaction, but the idea but by the time we're not talking about what we perceive, our perception of pain. There's a lot of things along the way there that goes on that we can modulate, and you can have shock in these other systems, make it so that you don't even temporarily feel the pain or realize what happened, right? So we have a lot of processing up there. This is referring to a reaction, and when it comes down to it, if someone shot, their body reacts, okay? There is some sort of reflex to it, but it doesn't mean that you're conscious of it. And so, just because that happened, if someone shots the hand, there's probably going to be a quick reaction. It's just, it's not quick enough to stop it unless you're in, the Matrix or something, and you're like doing all that or something. But the idea is, from a conscious level, we have a lot of other things going on that will mask our perception of pain. There's a long way before you get to the actual, our actual perceptual feeling of pain. And we have natural endorphins, and again, just shock itself will sort of, dampen it.
or like when you're sleeping and you don't feel pain, is the receptors inactive at that time?
See, that's what you. The receptors are not inactive. It's just somewhere up here, different parts of our brain we inactivate during sleep. We turn off centers of our brain that goes to, again, what we think, what we feel, our consciousness. Mm-hmm. This is a subconscious level. I mean, again, I don't know the experiments, but if you're asleep and someone puts a pin in your hand, your receptors should react. Okay, you should sort of have that reaction, because this is going to be just a pain reflex, unless you're on some sort of drug. Okay, so just to kind of again, I don't know if I can fully answer those questions. That's sort of my best guess at them. But overall, the idea of this pain reflex, spinal reflex, is something like that. And so again, this reflex, these receptors are working, even when you're sleeping, okay, else that wouldn't make any sense. You're going to have these free nerve endings, which are the pain receptors. They're going to synapse on the spinal cord, and the couple inner neurons in between will send an efferent out to cause this to withdraw. Okay? And that's going to be a reflex action. Now, we talked about this in lab. You can modulate reflexes, okay, if you are aware of it, right? If you know someone's going to stick a pin in your hand, or put your hand in the fire, you can I can take it, I'm a man, or whatever you want to call it. And so you can fight that, or with the knee-jerk response, you can sort of inhibit it some, including with this. But the receptor itself, this is normally happening unless you have some sort of spinal cord injury. So, all those reflexes should occur, but you might not realize it. So, pathway of pain of the brain. All this is to illustrate is, different touch receptors that, here they are. They're all, we can actually fill them up there. The pain receptors are actually the free nerve endings of your sensory neuron. And so we can actually start to fill this in if we have somatosensory touch. And we have pain. Okay? Somatosensory touch, if you look at some of these guys, and again, anatomy people, you probably know and identify these Burko receptors and Meissner corpuscles, whatever they are. But if you look at them, they are basically wrapped nerve endings. Okay? They're of one unit, basically. The actual receptors changing are the dendrites. So they're not like a specialized cell synapsing. Same thing with pain. If you look at those on the right, those are actually not even wrapped. Those are the dendrites of the free nerve endings of the sensory neuron itself. Free nerve endings. Okay? So both of those are the same. We're not going to have a specialized cell for a little while here. They're all one unit. The type of receptor, remember, which we're going to fill in, that's what stimuli it reacts to. And there were what? There were mechano and chemo and thermo and photo. So for touch, what kind is it? What is it reacting to? That's what it is. It's not going to react to other, to chemicals or temperature, these ones. They're reacting to a mechanical force that will then, alter the, in fact, you can kind of, see it even with this. If you're squeezing down on this, this wrapping around the dendrites, it's going to basically open up those gated channels, blah, blah, blah. Same thing here. So, but free nerve endings, okay, pain. Pain is survival. So, what is it react to? Is it going to react to extreme mechanical force? Sure, that's dangerous. How about a noxious chemical? How about a temperature that's really dangerous? It's the only one that reacts to more than one of those stimulus type. Okay? Let's be talking about pain. It's not the kidney, but I like it, okay? So we write 3 things here. In fact, I have this. Okay? Up there. So it responds to at least 3 of the 4. So it acts the same receptor itself. It's acting as a chemoreceptor. It can act as a mechanoreceptor or a temperature or thermoreceptor. Kind of everything but photo. Don't ask me why. Probably it does, but that's what the book says, and I'm sort of believing it right now. So that one receptor, besides being free nerve endings, can respond to all 3 of those. And I just talked about the other thing I want to talk about, the pathway to the brain and the idea of a spinal reflex. That's okay. I already did that. So we're going to talk about today, especially something called the gay theory of pain, that there are different types of pain. Some reach the brain very fast, and we're actually going to look at these fibers. Some are more slow, and we're going to talk today about referred pain, the idea if you have a heart attack, why you actually, what's the physiological reason you might feel pain in your left arm and shoulder. Okay, we'll see that. This figure up here, this table, is to just illustrate a point. Don't memorize it, but we talked before, I don't have it up anymore, that the speed of conduction of a neuron was dependent upon what 2 things?
Diameter and myelination.
So what I like about this is it gives 3 pain fibers, okay, 3 different types of fibers here, and kind of tells you what their characteristics are and the speed of conduction, and it fits. So if you have a small diameter, unmyelinated, it's still pretty fast. It's a couple meters per second. If you myelinate that, you expect it to be faster. If it's larger myelinated, even faster. So it just, by number illustrates that what we're saying is true. We don't want all our nerves to fire at the same rate. We want it to be different, and so this is kind of showing. Okay, now for the most important thing today. I take it right. But this is going to be really important. The gay theory of pain. And specifically the mechanism that we're going to use this figure, draw on the board. I'm going to have bullet points on this. What the gay theory of pain is basically saying, and we're going to show the pictures for it, is the fact, sort of this idea again, that let's say I hit my head. I can hit it harder. There we go. Okay? It's pain. I'm going to show that. If I rub my head now, does it feel better?
Yes.
Yes. Well, it depends. Okay? But the idea is, and then when you think it's, you might have, as a child, or maybe you have a child and they bruise their knee and you're rubbing it to make it feel better. Is that just an emotional response, or is it actually something physiological? The gay theory of pain says you're going to show a mechanism where it's actually physiological, where actually it's going to decrease the pain signal to your brain by actually rubbing the area, or some other non-painful stimulus. We look at acupuncture. One of the ways acupuncture now is thought to work is using this gay theory of pain. Okay, besides the fact of releasing natural painkillers, endorphins in the body, which it also does, it might fall into this. And the overall figures are shown here. And I'm going to redraw these one at a time so we can actually go through it. And what these figures are going to describe in A, B, and C is sort of, and we have this we did this a little bit with the drug. We started to get a little neural network going, kind of a simplification, but we're showing a few nerves working together to do something. And we're going to show first what's going on without pain. What's going on when we have a painful stimulus to this little neural network and negate their pain? How does this non-painful stimulus or touch affect and why we have less pain going to the brain, the perception of pain and actual pain signals. So we're going to do these one at a time, and we're going to draw them. We're going to draw them and describe them. And when you go home tonight, first thing you're going to do probably is go home on your whiteboard and do what? Draw them and describe them. Then you're going to wake up tomorrow, and of course, you already have the circle of life probably on your refrigerator and your ceiling and your walls. But now the first thing you do tomorrow, you're going to basically wake up and you're going to do what? You're going to draw them and describe them. Okay. As if it were a test question. All right. So we go to the first one, and I'm going to put this up. And what you want to realize is, overall, even though it's still simplification, we're looking at sort of 3 neurons here. Okay, until we get to the pain one. We have the C fiber, which is what's going to transmit the pain signal if we have a painful stimulus. We have the secondary pain fiber. Okay, the next one it's synapsing on. This is like, I'm going to go back a second. This is happening right here in the spinal cord, right, that first synapse. That's what we're kind of showing here. So this is the next one that's crossing and going to the brain. But we also have this guy, an inhibitory interneuron. And that's what the negative means. Remember, the negative means that when this is on, it's releasing neurotransmitter, which is causing an IPSP. Wow.
So listening.
Which is, what is that? I mean, I don't remember. That was a while ago. Actually, let's kind of play with that a bit. We have minus 70, minus 55, blah, blah, blah. This is our exponential. Okay, here, I guess I'll do it here. So speaking of what's on everywhere on your house, we have the circle of life. And what do we have inside here?
Negative charge protein.
And
potassium.
overall about.
70.
And outside. Chloride. Okay, we have EPSP, IPSP. Okay? Again, excitatory, inhibitory. Excitatory, we're sort of summarizing that neurotransmitter is going to cause an excitatory postsynaptic potential. And what is that here? Is that depolarization or hyperpolarization, EPSP? Depolarization. Okay? EPSPs make it closer to threshold, IPSPs further away. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay? Again, we're only looking at those ions. Okay? To cause an a excitatory postsynaptic potential, what are we going to open? Sodium comes in. Okay, I actually have to put. We're going to open sodium. We're going to open and close potassium. All that means positive comes in or positive stays in. One of those 3 is going to cause, when we say a positive there, you can see positive is further down there. That means the neurotransmitter release is going to cause an excitatory postsynaptic potential. It's doing one of those things. Either opening up a sodium channel or a calcium channel or closing potassium channel. That's what it's doing to create this. For IPSP, what do we want to do?
Open potassium.
Open
and open chloride.
Open potassium, open chloride, or close the other one, sodium. Okay? Any of those will cause it to be hyperpolarized or less. And again, why we do this right away is because you want to be able to just go from this to this and know it for any test question, right? You don't want to have, that was no card 17, I don't know what that is, and here's no card 2, okay? All this flows together. And again, then when you start looking at this positive, negative, that is what it's meaning. It's meaning when this is on, and right now these figures, they're on by when they color them in, that's going to release neurotransmitters that are either going to be excitatory to this postsynaptic cell or inhibitory. What specifically is happening? One of those channels are opening or closing, as we said. And we're not going to have to know specifically which one for this, but you have to know what the types are.
what the types are, meaning what?
As far as what could cause those,
Oh,
like
okay.
this channel things.
Oh.
So, A, again, if you look at the C fiber, which is transmission of pain, you see the way we're drawing it actually has sort of two, even though I know my drawings aren't perfect, and yours don't have to be either, but we have two termini. One is going to synapse upon the dendrites of the secondary neuron, okay? And this is to the brain. So this represents sort of the secondary two-knot pain fiber. Okay, here it just says ascending pain pathway. This whole thing is the C fiber. That's what's going to transmit the pain signal. But we've got this third guy in the middle here, okay, in which its dendrites are sort of being affected by the C fiber, but its nerve terminal is also synapsing upon the secondary fiber. And this is an inhibitory neuron. Which means when it is on, it is releasing neurotransmitters which cause an IPSP in this postsynaptic, in this one. That's why we're just summarizing by negative. Okay? So that's the overall diagram. You know, it doesn't have to be beautiful, but you have to make sure you're showing me that the C fiber is basically hitting the dendrites of the inner neuron and the dendrites of the secondary pain fiber. And the same thing in. This is terminating here. Both of these are affecting this. So, with A, no pain, which was figure A. Again, I'm going to be saying things, sort of summarizing it in easy terms of on, off. So if you look at this, you know, again, when it's not colored in, it means it's not firing. So if without pain, the C fiber is basically off. Remember, it's not really off. There is no off and on. It means it basically is not, you know, not transmitting that many action potentials because there's no pain signal. But we're going to sort of say, basically, instead of writing that down, that for the no pain, that, you know, the C fiber is not firing, not sending action potential, the C fiber is off. So as long as you know I'm simplifying it, it's a lot easier to kind of just say that. So, you know, there's no pain, so we're not sending signals. Okay? So we're not stimulating this. But that's not enough. Okay? So if you look over here, you know, we're not depolarizing this, right? There's nothing making a fire, and that should be good enough. But for us, we want to make sure when there's no pain signal that we don't feel any pain in the brain. So we're double whamming it. No pain, the C fiber is off. But what's happening to the inhibitory neuron? It is on. And therefore, it is hyperpolarizing the cell to make it even less likely to send a signal. So we're not satisfied with just staying here. We want to have, with no pain, basically it hyperpolarized, because we want to know when there's pain and no pain. So we double whammy it. We don't stimulate it, because this guy's off, and we inhibit it. So the C fiber is off, but the inhibitory neuron, inhibitory fiber, I'll just say, is on. Again, that means it is firing action potentials, releasing a neurotransmitter, which is causing an IPSP, hyperpolarizing this pain fiber, the secondary pain fiber, and therefore no pain to brain. Okay? Does everyone see the system in A here with no pain? C fiber, there's no pain, so it's basically not being stimulated. It's not doing anything here. This cell now is not being excited, but the inhibitory neuron is firing. It's releasing neurotransmitter, which is hyperpolarizing the cell, therefore no pain signal to the brain. You know, when we say this is inhibitory, which is what we're saying, that's sending a neurotransmitter which is inhibitory. What is that probably? What is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter we need to know? GABA. That's what it is. And that's what I want you to know. Even though I didn't say it up here, you want to know that in this case, and in most cases we're saying, if not, I'll tell you, in most cases we're saying that when we're looking at the inhibitory, it's basically, even though we don't list it here, it is GABA. GABA is the major inhibitory. This is releasing GABA when it's firing and hyperpolarizing.
What would an example of this be? Like when I guess you have pain, but it doesn't reach the brain.
Well, no, this is no pain right now.
Oh, just nothing at all.
Yeah, this is like how the network is set up right when there's no pain at all. Okay, that's no pain. We go to the next one, which is B, pain. And so we have no pain A. Okay, I should make it where I can have more, but I guess I can erase the circle of life because we know it. So for B, there's going to be a painful stimulus in the same network here. And so if you look at this, the C fiber now is on. Okay, it's colored. Yeah, it's colored, which means it is turned on, right? It's sending action potentials to further on, causing the release of neurotransmitters. Okay, so C fiber is on, again, to make it simple. C fiber is on. And the way we're looking at it, or the way the figure is describing it, it is doing two things, okay? Because it has these branches. It is doing what to the secondary secondary pain fiber?
Turning it on.
Turning it on, right? And again, it means positive, it's releasing a neurotransmitter, which is depolarizing it, making it more likely to fire. What else is it doing? Inhibiting the inhibitor. It's turning the inhibitory off. If you look at this, it's basically, we're putting a negative signal here, or an IPSB, and we're turning this off, so this no longer is inhibiting this. We've double whammied it the other way. Not only are we exciting this, we've cut off that inhibition that existed before. Remember, the guy before, this was inhibiting it. This wasn't stimulating it, this was inhibiting it, it was hyperpolarized. Now with pain, we're going to double whammy it the other way. We're going to directly depolarize it, and we turn off the inhibitor. Negative times a negative, again, is a positive. Remember, the two ways to increase something, you increase the positive, or you get rid of the negative, just like we did in the drug video. C fiber is basically initiating both of those. So if C fiber is turned on by the pain, it basically, however you want to say it, excites or depolarizes, whatever you want to say, the secondary pain fiber. But the second thing that it does is it turns off the inhibitory signal. And therefore, again, if you just look at the figure here, not only we're getting rid of any inhibition, and we're increasing the excitatory, and that means lots of action potentials, strong pain to brain.
Is that what is 2-0?
That's the next, 2-0, now is sort of like for secondary, are the next pain fiber. A lot of times you'll have one not being primary. It's just sort of a symbol makes me less I have to write, the better you have a chance of potentially reading it. So excites the secondary pain fiber, which is that next guy here, and turns off the inhibitory, therefore strong pain to brain. Okay, that positive again means a neurotransmitter which is going to be exciting or helping transmit pain. What is the major neurotransmitter for the transmission of P as in pain? Substance B. Okay? Remember back when you start looking at the other neurotransmitters you have to know, the major inhibitory was GABA. For pain transmission it was substance P. The other major excitatory was? Glutamate. Okay? Just sort of remember. Right now, we've been dealing with GABA and substance P. So remember that. I don't have to write it down. Are you ready for the gate? And then we'll end for today. Again, all these are pretty much here. I'm summarizing it sort of in bullet points here. So sort of the gate theory. Again, summary makes this pretty easy when you look at it. We can kind of look at it here. Now we've added sort of the fiber, which is sort of transmitting this non-painful stimulus, and it's synapsing upon this. It's got branches to other parts of the body, like all of these really do. But we care about sort of how it's interacting with this system here. And it is basically so if you kind of go for the alpha beta, and you need to know all the names, it's synapsing, at least in one part, upon the dendrites of the inhibitory neuron. So this is the alpha beta, the non-pain fiber that's transmitting it. And so here again, you have it, you've rubbed it or acupuncture or something like that, and looking at this, what is it doing? What specifically is it doing? Turning the inhibitory back on. Okay? We had, before this, just to kind of look at it again, we actually had the C fiber turn it off. Now, if you look at this, the C fiber is still doing what it was doing before. Okay? Because we still have the painful stimulus. But now we've got competition. By the alpha beta fiber non-painful basically is competing now, is helping to turn this back on. Instead of just having this inhibition turning it off, remember everything is summation. Now we have IPSPs, and competing with EPSPs, which means this is going to come on sometimes. And that means the same thing here. Back in this day, we were only getting depolarization. Now we're getting both, which means there's going to be less action potentials to the brain, and so the pain will decrease. The actual pain signal to the brain will decrease. Because now we have both excitatory and inhibitory. The very first one, only inhibitory, no pain to brain. The second one, only stimulatory, strong pain to brain. The third one, because of this touch, we have a competition now, less signal to the brain, less pain to brain. And literally, just as a bullet point then, the gate theory, we have this idea that rubbing stimulates the alpha beta, okay, our non-painful stimulus. Activates the alpha beta fiber. And this again turns inhibitory back on. Less pain to brain. Again, part of the way acupuncture might work appears to be sort of related to this, where you're putting, again, this looks really nasty up, but you're stimulating an area that's far away from the pain, but it helps modulate the pain. Again, some of it's natural endorphins, but now they're starting to see a little of it has to do with some of these networks of other neurons coming in to basically, you start getting some of this inhibition going. Things which have worked for thousands of years in Eastern medicine probably has some basis. I think, we're starting to let's see why this works, okay? It's not, and so Western medicine, besides just giving you drugs and, having surgery, which is really what Western medicine is, we're starting to at least kind of get to more of an approach of figuring out why. So that's sort of cool. I've never actually had acupuncture myself. My wife's done it before. I've always wanted to, though, so I don't know. Who's had acupuncture? Anybody?
I have.
Does it work?
No. I don't think so. I was gonna ask you about it. Like, when I had it done, it was for my foot, and they tried putting things on my wrists to help with that. I don't get how that's. I just don't get it.
Well, again,
Obviously.
I don't know enough. I don't know enough about it to really say. I mean, part of it has to do with this, but.
And then they tried some on my wrists, some on my face. It was weird.
Has it worked for anybody? See, it might vary. And you might want to get whoever they went to, because I think some people are better. But again, since I haven't had personal experience, I don't know. And again, I don't think we fully understand exactly why. But again, it does release natural painkillers in general, and some of it's related to this. But hey, we're all individual as well. Okay, so does everybody sort of get this? And you can start practicing with it. Okay, you want to be able to draw this in a fashion in which I see that you know where these nerve terminals are going. You can't have this out in space. You want to know the pain fibers, and you want to know at least the bullet points of what's happening at each of these stages.
Do we have to draw that little arrow out?
No, I don't care about that. I only care about if you draw this, these synapses in the right places. It doesn't have to be beautiful like that, but I can't have this somewhere out there. Okay? So we'll see you in lab.
You don't need the labels of stimulus there.
You need to know the labels of.
Painful stimulus
No, you just have to, you have to describe, if you do it like in the bullet point next to it, then you're fine. But you do have to know the fibers, alpha, beta, and C fibers. You don't be like,
If you want.
My name's Jason. I was in your class last fall.